November 23rd, 1962, 11:20 a.m. Roslyn Drive, North Side, Youngstown, Ohio. Charlie Cavallaro turns the key in his 1960 Oldsmobile Super 88. His 11-year-old son Tommy sits beside him in the front seat. His 12-year-old son Charlie Jr. is in the back. They're heading home after visiting relatives the day after Thanksgiving. The bomb detonates instantly. The explosion is so powerful it heavily damages the garage behind the house, shattering windows along the block. Charlie Sr.'s body is mutilated and thrown clear of the vehicle. Tommy dies at the scene. Charlie Jr., thrown from the vehicle, survives but will spend 86 days in the hospital, undergoing a 5-hour surgery that leaves him with permanent hip injuries. This isn't the first car bomb in Youngstown. It won't be the last. By the time the smoke clears on Youngstown's mob war, the city will have earned a nickname that will define it for generations. Bombtown USA. 75 bombings between 1952 and 1962. 11 mob murders in that single decade, according to the Saturday Evening Post's 1963 investigation. A city where turning your car ignition became an act of courage, where the thunderclap of explosives became as familiar as factory whistles, where corruption ran so deep that criminals operated openly and law enforcement looked the other way, or worse, participated. This is the story of how a mid-sized steel town sitting between two mafia empires became America's most bombed city. How geography created destiny. How money corrupted everything. How a war between Cleveland and Pittsburgh mob families turned Youngstown streets into a battlefield where car bombs replaced diplomacy and violence became normal. The Cavallaro bombing, with an 11-year-old boy killed alongside his father, finally brought Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's attention and massive FBI resources to a city that had been tearing itself apart in plain sight for over a decade. But by then, the patterns were set. The damage was done. Youngstown had become synonymous with mob violence, and the bombs would keep coming for years. To understand how Youngstown became Bombtown USA, you have to understand its geography. The city sits 65 miles southeast of Cleveland and 61 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. Two major mafia families, two spheres of influence, and Youngstown, right in the middle, functioned like an open city, territory that no single family exclusively controlled, but that both families wanted desperately to dominate. This geographic position, which might have made Youngstown a neutral ground, instead made it a perpetual war zone. Cleveland's crime family, led by boss John Scalish through the 1950s and 1960s, saw Youngstown as natural expansion territory. Close enough to control, far enough from their core operations to provide insulation from law enforcement scrutiny. Pittsburgh's crime family, under boss Sebastian Big John LaRocca, starting in 1956, had historical claims to Youngstown dating back to Prohibition-era bootlegging alliances. Neither family would yield. Neither family could completely dominate. So they fought, and fought, and fought. But geography alone doesn't explain Bombtown USA. Money does. By the 1950s, Youngstown was flush with cash from its steel industry. Workers at the mills earned good wages. They gambled. They borrowed money. They frequented bars and clubs. The bug, local slang for the numbers racket, a lottery-style gambling operation, was generating substantial revenue. FBI estimates suggest the entire city's bug operations could reach $1 million annually, with major locations pulling in several $1,000s weekly. Multiply that across dozens of locations, add bookmaking operations, slot machines, loan sharking, and union control at the steel mills, and you're looking at millions flowing through Youngstown's underworld annually. That kind of money attracts predators. More importantly, it attracts organized predators, the kind who build systems, who corrupt officials, who use violence strategically rather than impulsively. The Mafia families in Cleveland and Pittsburgh looked at Youngstown and saw opportunity, but they also saw each other, and neither was willing to share. The culture of corruption in Youngstown made the mob war possible. This wasn't a city where organized crime operated in shadows, constantly evading vigilant law enforcement. This was a city where, as the 1963 Saturday Evening Post article, Crimetown USA, put it, officials hobnob openly with criminals. Arrests of racketeers are rare, convictions rarer still, and tough sentences almost unheard of. Judges were bought, police were compromised. Politicians understood the arrangement. The mob kept a certain kind of order, prevented random street crime, ensured gambling operations ran smoothly, and in exchange, they were allowed to operate. Permits were negotiable. Licenses were for sale. Political jobs went to those who understood the system. The public largely accepted this arrangement because many people were making money from it, directly or indirectly. The steel mills were booming in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Jobs were plentiful. If you weren't involved in the rackets yourself, you probably knew someone who was. And as long as the violence stayed within the underworld, criminals killing criminals, most citizens looked the other way. But the violence didn't stay contained. The 1950s saw the beginning of the bombing campaign that would define Youngstown for decades. The war started over the bug, the numbers racket that generated so much cash. Two men emerged as the primary competitors, Sandy Naples and Vince De Niro, born James Vincent De Niro in 1920. Sandy Naples was aligned with Pittsburgh. He was called the Policy King, running extensive numbers operations across Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley. Vince De Niro aligned with Cleveland and owned Cicero's restaurant on Market Street, which served as both a legitimate business and a headquarters for his operations. The two men competed directly for the same territory, the same customers, the same revenue. Negotiations failed. Territories couldn't be clearly divided, so they turned to bombs. The bombing campaign of the 1950s established patterns that would persist for years. Car bombs were the weapon of choice, devastating, terrifying, and with the added benefit that bomb-making techniques were difficult to trace. Dynamite was readily available in an industrial city where mining and construction were common. A stick of dynamite wired to a car's ignition system could be assembled relatively simply by someone with basic knowledge. The explosion would destroy evidence. Witnesses were rare because the bombs detonated in seconds, and crucially, investigating bombings required resources and expertise that Youngstown's police department either lacked or chose not to deploy. The violence escalated through the 1950s with both sides using bombs to intimidate rivals, punish betrayals, and claim territory. March 12, 1960. Sandy Naples and his girlfriend Marianne Vrancich are killed by shotgun blasts. The murder is sudden, violent, and sends shockwaves through Youngstown's underworld. Naples had been a major power, controlling significant bug operations and maintaining Pittsburgh's influence in the city. His death creates both a power vacuum and a debt. Someone needs to answer for killing one of Pittsburgh's key earners. His younger brother, Joey Naples, will eventually step into that role, sponsored by Pittsburgh and determined to maintain the family's influence. But first, there's retaliation to consider. Cleveland, widely believed responsible for Sandy's murder, prepares for consequences. August 11, 1960. Billy Naples, Sandy's brother, is killed by a car bomb. The Naples family is being systematically targeted. First Sandy in March, now Billy in August. The message is clear. Pittsburgh's influence in Youngstown is under assault. Joey Naples, the surviving brother, will spend years rebuilding what his family lost. But the violence continues escalating. July 17, 1961. 12:10 a.m. Vince De Niro leaves Cicero's restaurant on Market Street. He walks to his car, turns the ignition. The car bomb detonates, killing him instantly. The explosion outside his own restaurant, his headquarters, his power base, sends a clear message. No one is safe. No location is protected. De Niro's death is widely attributed to Pittsburgh's revenge for Sandy Naples. The back and forth between Cleveland and Pittsburgh intensifies. Each hit demands retaliation. Each retaliation demands counter-retaliation. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. The bombs aren't just weapons anymore, they're communication. They signal territorial claims, warn against expansion, punish betrayals, and demonstrate power to both criminal rivals and potential recruits who need to understand who controls what. Then comes November 23, 1962, the Cavallaro bombing, the day after Thanksgiving. A 60-year-old man and his 11-year-old son killed by a car bomb. Charlie Jr., age 12, survives but with permanent injuries. 86 days in the hospital, 5 hours of surgery, a hip that will never fully heal. The bombing crosses a line that even Youngstown's jaded public can't ignore. Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro was a Cleveland crime family associate, involved in various rackets, certainly not innocent. But his 11-year-old son, Tommy, was. The boy's death outrages even those who'd accepted mob violence as the cost of doing business. Media coverage explodes. Not just local, but national. The Saturday Evening Post sends reporter John Kobler to investigate. His article, Crimetown USA, appears in 1963 with a subtitle that captures Youngstown perfectly. Youngstown has had 75 bombings, 11 killings in a decade, and no one seems to care. But after the Cavallaro bombing, people care. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy personally orders increased FBI presence in Youngstown. The FBI opens case file Cav Bomb and dedicates resources to investigating not just this one bombing, but the entire pattern of violence. Federal wiretaps begin capturing conversations. Agents start building cases. The violence had always been understood within mob circles. It was business, it was territorial, it was professional. But killing an 11-year-old boy brought scrutiny that even Youngstown's corrupt political structure couldn't deflect. Interestingly, the bombing also prompted internal Mafia discussions. Later wiretaps of New Jersey's DeCavalcante family captured mobsters discussing how the Cavallaro bombing violated unspoken rules. Killing children, even accidentally, brought heat that hurt everyone's operations. Some Mafia families allegedly instituted informal bans on using explosives after the Cavallaro incident, preferring traditional hits that were quieter and less likely to generate public outrage. But Youngstown's mob war didn't end in 1962. The Cavallaro bombing marked a peak of public attention, but the underlying conditions, two families claiming the same territory, substantial revenue from illegal operations, systemic corruption, remained unchanged. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the violence continued, though perhaps with slightly more discretion after the federal spotlight intensified. The methods evolved. Car bombs remained in use, but the targets became more selective. The goal shifted from wholesale territorial warfare to surgical strikes, eliminating specific rivals, punishing specific betrayals, sending specific messages. The bombings became more professional, more calculated, less likely to result in collateral damage that attracted unwanted attention. The 1970s brought new complications. The steel industry, which had been Youngstown's economic foundation, began declining. Foreign competition, outdated facilities, and changing markets started eroding the mill's profitability. This economic shift affected the mob in complex ways. On one hand, declining wages and job losses meant less money flowing through gambling operations. Workers with uncertain employment don't bet as freely. On the other hand, economic desperation created recruitment opportunities. Men who might have worked legitimate jobs in the mills became available for criminal work. The mob always needs soldiers, drivers, collectors, muscle. Youngstown's declining economy provided a ready supply. The corruption that had characterized Youngstown for decades deepened as economic desperation made officials even more willing to accept payoffs, to look the other way, to participate in schemes that might provide financial security as legitimate opportunities disappeared. Key figures emerged during this period who would define Youngstown's underworld for years. Ronald the Crab Carabbia became Cleveland's primary representative in Youngstown, controlling gambling operations, skimming from various enterprises, and serving as the point person for Cleveland's interests in the city. Joey Naples, Sandy's younger brother, rebuilt Pittsburgh's influence through the bug operations his brother had pioneered, but also expanded into bookmaking and eventually cocaine distribution as drug markets opened in the 1970s. The relationship between these two men, Carabbia representing Cleveland, Naples representing Pittsburgh, encapsulated the larger conflict between the two families. They competed for the same revenue streams, cultivated relationships with the same corrupt officials, and recruited from the same pool of potential soldiers. The arrangement was unstable by design. Both men were ambitious. Both families wanted dominance, not détente. The Teamsters Union became increasingly important to mob operations in the 1970s. Union pension funds provided capital for various schemes. Union control allowed influence over which contractors got jobs, which businesses faced labor problems, which politicians received campaign contributions from organized labor. Youngstown's steel mills, though declining, still employed thousands of union workers. Control over even portions of that workforce provided enormous leverage. The mob's infiltration of unions wasn't unique to Youngstown. It was happening nationwide. But Youngstown's geographic position between Cleveland and Pittsburgh meant that union corruption became another battleground. Which family controlled which union locals? Which pension funds could be accessed? Which labor leaders were reliable? These questions generated conflict, which generated violence, which generated more bombings. The bombings of the 1970s followed patterns established in the 1950s and 1960s, but with evolving targets. Business owners who refused to pay protection found their establishments bombed, not always completely destroyed, sometimes just damaged enough to send a message. Bookmakers who switched family allegiance, moving their operations from Pittsburgh to Cleveland or vice versa, became targets. The message was clear: loyalty is mandatory, betrayal is fatal. Some bombings targeted homes rather than cars, designed to terrorize rather than kill. A bomb on your front porch communicates, "We know where you live, we know your family, comply or face consequences." Other bombings remained lethal, cars exploding outside nightclubs and parking lots and driveways. Each bombing reinforced Youngstown's reputation. Insurance companies began raising rates or refusing coverage entirely. The economic costs of the mob war extended far beyond the immediate damage. They affected everyone trying to operate legitimately in an environment defined by organized crime violence. Youngstown's normalization of violence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bombtown USA. Residents developed dark humor about starting their cars, jokes about checking under the hood, about letting your car warm up from a distance, about parking in different locations. The sound of explosions, which would provoke panic in most cities, became almost routine in Youngstown. Not that people weren't afraid, they were, but fear became background noise. something you learn to live with like traffic or bad weather. This normalization made the violence sustainable in ways it couldn't be in cities with functioning law enforcement and civic institutions that responded to organized crime. Youngstown's institutions were compromised. The police couldn't effectively investigate bombings when many officers were on mob payrolls. The prosecutors couldn't win convictions when judges were corrupt. The politicians couldn't reform a system they personally benefited from. The cycle reinforced itself. Violence led to fear. Fear led to silence. Silence allowed more violence. But the system wasn't entirely without resistance. There were periodic reform attempts, police chiefs who tried to clean up departments, mayors who campaigned against corruption, federal prosecutors who built cases despite local obstruction. In the late 1940s, Mayor Charles Henderson appointed Chief of Police Edward J. Allen, who made genuine efforts to combat organized crime. Allen faced resistance from within his own department. Officers who supplemented their salaries with mob payoffs didn't appreciate reforms that threatened that income. He faced political pressure from officials who depended on mob support for their elections. And he faced the practical reality that investigating organized crime in a city where witnesses don't talk, evidence disappears, and even successful prosecutions result in light sentences is nearly impossible. Allen's tenure demonstrated the limits of individual reform in a systemically corrupt environment. Without broader institutional change, which would require political will that didn't exist, reform efforts remained symbolic rather than effective. The late 1970s brought increased federal attention. The FBI's resources had expanded since the 1960s. Wiretapping technology improved. The RICO statute, passed in 1970, provided prosecutors with tools to target entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual crimes. Federal investigators began building comprehensive cases, documenting patterns of racketeering rather than prosecuting isolated incidents. This shift mattered because it allowed prosecutors to connect individual bombings and murders to larger criminal conspiracies, instead of charging someone with one specific murder, which required finding witnesses, physical evidence, and overcoming local corruption. RICO allowed charges based on patterns of criminal activity. If prosecutors could prove someone participated in an ongoing criminal enterprise, individual crimes became evidence of that participation rather than standalone charges that needed independent proof. But building RICO cases takes time. Years of surveillance, thousands of hours of recorded conversations, cooperation from informants willing to testify. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, the FBI was laying groundwork for prosecutions that wouldn't come until later. Meanwhile, the violence continued. The war between Cleveland and Pittsburgh over Youngstown didn't resolve. It evolved. Ronald Carabbia, representing Cleveland, grew increasingly ambitious through the late 1970s. He wasn't content to simply manage operations on behalf of Cleveland's bosses. He wanted autonomy, wanted to make his own deals, wanted a larger share of profits. This ambition created tension not just with Pittsburgh, but with his own Cleveland family leadership. Ambitious soldiers are useful until they become threats. Carabbia's position became increasingly precarious. The situation came to a head around 1980. Carabbia was involved in skimming operations, taking money from gambling and other rackets before it was fully reported to the Cleveland leadership. Skimming from your own family is dangerous. Skimming from operations that involve both Cleveland and Pittsburgh is suicidal. According to FBI informants and widely held belief in law enforcement circles, Carabbia was skimming from operations that had connections to both families. The exact details are murky. These operations were deliberately opaque. But the consequence was clear. Carabbia needed to be removed. The hit was professional. Carabbia was last seen getting into a car, apparently for a meeting with associates. He was never seen again. His body was never found. Informants later claimed he was cremated in a furnace operated at maximum heat, leaving no physical evidence, though this has never been confirmed. This wasn't a car bomb. This wasn't a public execution. This was an internal matter handled with discretion. Carabbia simply disappeared. His family eventually had him declared legally dead, but no murder investigation produced results. The message to Youngstown's underworld was clear. Ronald Carabbia, Cleveland's primary representative, was gone. Pittsburgh gained significant advantage in the struggle for Youngstown. Carabbia's disappearance in 1980 marked a strategic shift. Pittsburgh, through Joey Naples and other operatives, controlled major rackets, bookmaking, loan sharking, whatever remained of the bug operations, and increasingly, cocaine distribution as drug markets exploded in the 1980s. The bombings decreased noticeably. The record-setting cluster of 1950 to 1963, followed by periodic flares in the late 1970s, gave way to relative calm. Internal disputes within Pittsburgh's operations still generated occasional violence, but the systematic warfare between Cleveland and Pittsburgh had diminished significantly. Joey Naples consolidated power through the 1980s. He wasn't flashy in the traditional mobster sense. No public persona, no celebrity lifestyle. He operated businesses, strip clubs, bars, bookmaking operations run out of various fronts. He cultivated political relationships, ensuring that the corrupt arrangements that protected mob operations remained intact despite periodic reform rhetoric from politicians. He managed soldiers and associates, resolving disputes, enforcing discipline, maintaining the structure that allowed criminal enterprises to function. He kicked money up to Pittsburgh's leadership, which by 1978 was under boss Michael Genovese, ensuring they remained satisfied with Youngstown's profitability. In other words, he did everything a successful mob representative does, and for years it worked. But Naples made enemies. Some were external. Cleveland never entirely abandoned claims to Youngstown, and remnants of that faction resented Pittsburgh's dominance. Charlie Cavallaro, who became Cleveland's boss in 1976 after John Scalish's death, maintained interest in Youngstown despite Carabbia's disappearance. Some of Naples' enemies were internal. Soldiers within Pittsburgh's own structure who felt Naples kept too much for himself, who wanted his position, who believed they could do better. Ambition is endemic to organized crime, the same qualities that make someone effective as a criminal: ruthlessness, strategic thinking, willingness to use violence make them threats to their own leadership. Naples understood this. He used violence preventively, eliminating potential threats before they materialized. But you can't eliminate everyone. Eventually, someone gets through. March 1991. Joey Naples leaves his girlfriend's house. He's walking to his car when a sniper, hidden across the street, fires. The shot is precise or professional. Naples dies almost instantly. The assassination was planned, probably surveilled for days to establish patterns, executed by someone with firearms expertise. The identity of the shooter was never definitively established. Multiple theories circulated: Cleveland seeking revenge for decades of being shut out of Youngstown, disgruntled soldiers within Pittsburgh's own organization, even the possibility of Pittsburgh's leadership under Michael Genovese deciding Naples had become a liability. Too high profile, too likely to attract federal attention in an era when RICO prosecutions were dismantling mob families nationwide. Naples' death created another power vacuum, but by 1991 the landscape had changed fundamentally. The steel industry that had sustained Youngstown for generations was dead. The mills that employed tens of thousands had closed or drastically reduced operations. The economic base that generated the gambling revenue that created the demand for mob services had collapsed. The money simply wasn't there anymore. Who's going to bet on numbers when they're unemployed? Who's borrowing money when there's no expectation of paying it back? The mob's business model depended on a functioning working-class economy. Youngstown no longer had that. Simultaneously, federal law enforcement had become far more effective. RICO prosecutions were destroying traditional mob families. Witness protection programs encouraged cooperation. Wiretapping captured incriminating conversations. The FBI wasn't limited to local investigations anymore. They could build national cases connecting activities across multiple cities. Pittsburgh's crime family, like others, faced unprecedented pressure. Through the 1990s, Youngstown's mob presence fragmented. There was no single successor to Naples powerful enough to dominate. Various crews operated independently, pursuing whatever opportunities existed: small-time bookmaking, cocaine dealing, loan sharking to the desperate. But the organized family-backed operations that defined previous decades were gone. The bombings continued sporadically. Only a handful occurred in the entire decade, perhaps 2 to 4 total, each tied to drug disputes or personal vendettas, rather than the systematic territorial warfare of earlier eras. By the time the 20th century ended, Youngstown's reputation as Bombtown USA was historical rather than current. The violence that defined the city for the 1950s through early 1980s had finally subsided, not because peace was negotiated or law enforcement won, but because the economic conditions that made Youngstown valuable to organized crime had disappeared. The FBI eventually launched comprehensive investigations, Operation Briar Hill among others, that resulted in numerous indictments of bookmakers, labor leaders, and mob associates. These prosecutions, conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, finally held people accountable for activities that had operated openly for decades. Convictions were secured, prison sentences were imposed. The institutional corruption that enabled Bombtown USA was, if not eliminated, at least significantly disrupted. Federal oversight of certain union locals prevented the kind of mob infiltration that had been routine. Banking regulations made money laundering more difficult. Changes in gambling, legal lotteries, offshore betting, eventual legalization in various forms, eliminated the monopoly that numbers rackets once enjoyed. Congressman James Traficant, who represented Youngstown in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1985 to 2002, embodied the city's complicated relationship with corruption. Traficant was flamboyant, combative, and eventually convicted of racketeering and bribery, expelled from Congress in 2002 and sentenced to prison. His career paralleled Youngstown's own trajectory, a place where the lines between legitimate politics and organized crime were so blurred that distinguishing them became impossible. Traficant fought both the mob and the FBI often simultaneously in ways that made sense only in Youngstown's peculiar ecosystem. His conviction and imprisonment symbolized the federal government's determination to finally clean up a city that had resisted accountability for generations. The legacy of Bombtown USA is complex. Youngstown earned the highest concentration of car bombings in U.S. history during specific periods, particularly the 1950s to 1963 era that generated 75 bombings and 11 mob murders in a single decade. The violence killed dozens over the entire period from the 1950s through the 1980s, injured hundreds, and terrorized thousands. It destroyed legitimate businesses, drove away investment, and created an atmosphere of fear that persisted for decades. Insurance became expensive or unavailable. Property values suffered. Youngstown's reputation as a crime-ridden city hurt economic development efforts long after the actual violence subsided. Young people left, seeking opportunities in cities that hadn't been war zones. The population declined. The tax base eroded. The physical infrastructure deteriorated. The steel industry's collapse would have hurt Youngstown regardless. But the mob war made recovery far more difficult. Yet Youngstown's story matters precisely because it demonstrates what happens when corruption becomes systemic, when law enforcement is compromised, when two powerful criminal organizations fight over the same territory without resolution. Youngstown was a case study in institutional failure. Every system that should have prevented or stopped the violence instead enabled it. Police were bought. Prosecutors were ineffective or complicit. Judges issued light sentences when convictions occurred at all. Politicians depended on mob support and mob money. The media covered bombings as routine news, barely mentioning them after a while. The public normalized violence because what else could they do? Leave? Move away from jobs, family, homes because criminals were fighting. Most people just learned to live with it. Developed coping mechanisms, told themselves it wouldn't happen to them as long as they weren't involved in the rackets. Youngstown also demonstrates the particular dynamics of cities that function like open territory in mafia operations. Unlike cities clearly controlled by one family, Chicago by the outfit, New York divided among 5 families with defined territories. Youngstown remained contested. Both Cleveland and Pittsburgh had legitimate historical claims. Both had invested resources. Both had developed operations generating substantial revenue. Neither could completely dominate without provoking open warfare that would hurt everyone's bottom line, but neither could accept the other's dominance either. So they fought proxy wars through local soldiers, through bombings that sent messages without triggering full-scale mob conflict that would attract even more federal attention. Youngstown's residents paid the price for this strategic ambiguity. The human cost deserves emphasis. Tommy Cavallaro was 11 years old. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He wasn't even old enough to understand what his father did for a living. He was a kid getting into a car with his dad and his brother, probably excited about leftover Thanksgiving turkey. Maybe thinking about Christmas coming in a few weeks. The bomb didn't care. The men who planted it knew a child might be in that car. They did it anyway because in Youngstown circa 1962, killing an 11-year-old was acceptable collateral damage in a territorial dispute over gambling revenue. That calculation, that a child's life was worth less than sending a message to a rival, captures something essential about Bombtown USA. This wasn't just crime. This was a complete breakdown of the basic social contract that says some things are unacceptable regardless of circumstances. Charlie Jr., who survived that bombing, lived the rest of his life with injuries and trauma from that morning. 86 days in the hospital, 5 hours of surgery, permanent hip damage, and the psychological scars of knowing his father and brother died in an explosion meant to accomplish what, exactly? Control of some gambling operations, a larger share of profits? The violence in Youngstown was so routine, so continuous that individual motivations often became lost in the chaos. Bombings happened because bombings happened. Revenge demanded counter-revenge, demanded counter-revenge until the original cause barely mattered. The violence became self-sustaining, a machine that ran on its own momentum. The physical remnants of Bombtown USA are mostly gone now. Bomb sites were repaired or demolished. The buildings where mob meetings occurred are torn down or repurposed. The cars that exploded are long since scrapped. Youngstown's landscape doesn't bear obvious scars of its violent past, the way, say, Sarajevo's buildings still show bullet holes. But drive through certain neighborhoods and older residents can point out locations. That parking lot is where Vince De Niro's car exploded in 1961. This street corner is where a bookmaker was bombed in the 1970s. That intersection is where Joey Naples was shot in 1991. The collective memory persists even as the physical evidence fades. Youngstown cemeteries tell part of the story. Tombstones for Sandy Naples, for Vince De Niro, for Charlie and Tommy Cavallaro, for Billy Naples, for dozens of others killed in the mob war. Some graves are well maintained, visited regularly by families who lost fathers, brothers, sons. Others are neglected. Criminals whose families moved away or who have no one left to remember them. Death is democracy's ultimate expression, the saying goes, and Youngstown cemeteries hold victims and perpetrators, innocents and criminals, side by side in the soil. The violence that separated them in life is irrelevant in death. Today, Youngstown struggles with the legacy of its past while trying to build a future. The city has worked to diversify its economy beyond steel, to attract new businesses, to rehabilitate its image. Downtown revitalization efforts attempt to create the kind of vibrant urban core that died when the steel mills closed and the mob war made the city toxic to investment. Some progress has occurred. Youngstown State University provides economic stability and brings young people to the city. Some businesses have opened. Some neighborhoods show signs of renewal. But the population remains far below its peak. The economic opportunities remain limited. The reputation as Bombtown USA remains a barrier that marketing campaigns struggle to overcome. The question Youngstown raises is whether redemption is possible, whether a city so thoroughly defined by corruption and violence can reinvent itself, can become something other than its worst history. The answer seems to be partially, incompletely, with difficulty. Youngstown will never fully escape Bombtown USA. That history is too dramatic, too violent, too embedded in national consciousness of what organized crime looks like in America. But it doesn't have to remain defined solely by that history. The people living in Youngstown today weren't responsible for the mob wars of the 1950s through 1980s. They're trying to build lives in a city that's working to overcome its past. That effort deserves recognition even if it doesn't erase the history. The FBI's success in eventually prosecuting Youngstown's mob activities demonstrates that law enforcement, given sufficient resources and federal authority, can dismantle even deeply entrenched criminal organizations. But it also demonstrates how long that process takes when local institutions are compromised. The violence started in the 1950s. Federal prosecutions that significantly impacted the mob didn't come until the 1990s. 4 decades, 2 generations, hundreds of victims. The delay wasn't because the FBI didn't know what was happening. They did. It was because building cases, securing cooperation, overcoming local obstruction, and navigating legal requirements all take time. By the time justice arrived, much of the damage was irreversible. The broader lesson Youngstown teaches is about the importance of institutional integrity. Corruption at one level, say a few police officers taking payoffs, is manageable. Systemic corruption, where police, prosecutors, judges, and politicians are all compromised, creates conditions where organized crime flourishes. Youngstown demonstrates what happens when those institutions fail. Violence becomes routine, criminals operate openly, and ordinary citizens suffer consequences they didn't cause and can't prevent. Rebuilding institutional integrity after such comprehensive failure is extraordinarily difficult. It requires leadership willing to sacrifice politically, officers willing to risk their careers and potentially their lives. prosecutors willing to work for years building cases, and a public willing to support reform even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. The comparison between Youngstown and other mob cities is instructive. Chicago had tremendous mob violence, but Chicago also had periods of effective law enforcement that disrupted organized crime operations. New York's five families were powerful, but New York's size and resources meant that law enforcement could function independently of mob influence. Las Vegas was mob-controlled, but it was smaller, and eventually corporate interests displaced criminal ones. Youngstown was unique in combining sustained violence over decades, complete institutional corruption, two competing families rather than one dominant organization, economic dependence on industries vulnerable to mob infiltration, and geographic isolation that limited external scrutiny. That combination created Bombtown USA, November 23, 1962. Roslyn Drive. A bomb explodes, killing a man and his 11-year-old son. The blast echoes across Youngstown, across the nation, forcing people to confront what their city had become. But the echoes fade, the investigation stalls. No one is ever charged with the Cavallaro bombing. FBI case file Cav Bomb remains officially unsolved. The men who built that bomb, who planted it, who knew a child might die, they walked free. Maybe they lived out their lives in Youngstown, starting their own cars carefully for a while, wondering if revenge would come, gradually relaxing as years passed without consequence. Maybe they moved away, started over somewhere, told no one about their past. Maybe they died, taking their secrets to graves where no one mourns them. The silence that protected Youngstown's bombers for decades persists, in some ways even now. People who know things don't talk. Families of victims often don't want publicity, don't want to be known as mob-connected even by association. Perpetrators who survive have no incentive to confess. The code of silence, omerta, that the Mafia enforced through fear and violence continues through inertia, even after the organizations that enforced it have crumbled. Breaking that silence requires courage that's in short supply when there's no clear benefit to speaking and potential costs remain real. But history demands accounting. The story of Bombtown USA needs to be told not to glorify violence, not to romanticize organized crime, but to document what happened and why. To remember victims like Tommy Cavallaro, who deserve to be more than statistics in FBI reports. To understand how systemic corruption enables violence that wouldn't be tolerated in functioning societies. To recognize that the choices made in Youngstown, to accept mob influence, to normalize corruption, to prioritize short-term gain over institutional integrity, have consequences that persist long after the initial decisions seem forgotten. Youngstown looks different now than it did in 1962 or 1980 or 1991. The steel mills that defined its economy are gone, their massive structures demolished or rusting slowly. The neighborhoods that housed workers are half empty, populations declined by jobs that aren't coming back. The streets where bombs once echoed are quiet now, not with peace necessarily, but with the silence of economic defeat. The mob is gone, or nearly so, their rackets obsolete or moved to new technologies that don't require geographic presence. The corruption that enabled Bombtown USA has diminished, though not disappeared entirely. Institutional rot takes generations to fully eliminate. But Youngstown survives. Diminished, scarred, struggling, but surviving. The people who live there now are building something from the ruins. Not the industrial powerhouse that existed before, probably never that again, but something. Communities still function. Schools still teach children. Businesses still serve customers. Life continues in the shadow of history, that most Americans don't know or have forgotten. For them, Youngstown is home, not a cautionary tale about mob violence. They're entitled to that present tense existence, even if historians and documentarians keep dragging up the past. The bomb stopped not because anyone won, but because there was nothing left to fight for. The steel industry died, the gambling revenue dried up, the political protection that made operations viable deteriorated under federal pressure. The cost-benefit analysis that drives organized crime shifted. Youngstown was no longer worth the investment, the risk, the violence. So the families moved on to other opportunities, other cities, other rackets. Youngstown was left to deal with the consequences, the reputation, the trauma, the economic destruction, while the criminals who caused it dispersed to other territories. That's perhaps the most bitter aspect of Bombtown USA. The people most responsible for the violence largely escaped accountability. Some went to prison, yes, eventually, but most didn't. They lived comfortable lives funded by criminal proceeds. They retired to Florida or Arizona or Nevada, bought legitimate businesses with dirty money, enjoyed grandchildren and golf and the rewards of careers that destroyed a city. Meanwhile, Youngstown, the place, the people who couldn't leave, bore the costs, the bombed-out buildings, the murdered fathers and brothers, the children like Charlie Jr. who survived with permanent injuries, the workers who lost jobs when businesses closed, because who wants to operate in a war zone? The civic institutions that withered under corruption, the reputation that lingered long after the violence stopped. Justice, even delayed and incomplete, matters. The federal prosecutions of the 1990s and 2000s, while too late for many victims, at least provided some accountability. The conviction sent a message that even in cities as corrupt as Youngstown once was, law eventually reaches criminals. The prison sentences, while often shorter than victims' families wanted, at least represented acknowledgement that what happened in Youngstown was criminal, not just business as usual. The institutional reforms, while incomplete, at least created barriers to future mob infiltration. It's not enough, it's never enough, but it's something. The story of Bombtown USA should haunt American consciousness the way other mob stories do. We remember the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. 7 men killed in a garage. We remember the Appalachian meeting in upstate New York that exposed the Mafia's national structure. We remember the Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport. We remember Whitey Bulger's reign in Boston. But Youngstown, 75 bombings, 82 unsolved murders, an 11-year-old boy killed in his father's car, somehow remains obscure. The violence was too sustained, too chaotic, too mundane in its repetition to create defining moments that stick in memory. Each individual bombing was news for a day, then forgotten as the next explosion occurred. The sheer volume of violence made it unremarkable, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Bombtown USA. Today, when young people start cars in Youngstown, they don't think about bombs. The fear that once made turning an ignition an act of courage has faded. Most residents under 40 have no direct memory of the mob war years. The history exists in books, in newspaper archives, in FBI files, in memories of those old enough to remember. But it's not lived experience anymore. That's progress in a sense, a city moving beyond its worst history, a new generation not traumatized by their predecessors' failures. But it's also forgetting, and some things shouldn't be forgotten entirely. The cost was too high. The lessons are too important. Wick Avenue, where that September 1966 bombing occurred in the Outlines opening, just one of dozens of locations across Youngstown where the ground still holds bomb residue in its soil. where carbon scoring marked buildings long since demolished, where violence became so routine it stopped making headlines. That ordinariness, that normalization of extraordinary violence defined Bombtown USA. Not dramatic shootouts or spectacular heists, but grinding, continuous, low-level warfare that destroyed a city over decades. The final bombings of the 1990s had none of the significance of earlier attacks. They were epilogues to a story already concluded. Criminal loose ends tied up with violence that barely registered in a city grown numb to explosions. By then, Youngstown's reputation was set. Bombtown USA, the most bombed city in American history. A place where organized crime operated so openly, for so long, with such devastating effect that it became the defining characteristic of an entire city. The steel mills made Youngstown. The mob war destroyed it. And in the ruins, people are trying to build something new, knowing that the shadow of the past will never fully disappear. The question isn't whether Youngstown can forget Bombtown USA. It can't. The question is whether it can move forward despite that history, whether redemption is possible not through erasing the past, but through building a future that isn't determined by it. The answer unfolds daily in the lives of people who call Youngstown home, who are working to create opportunity where desperation once bred violence, who are trying to prove that cities can recover from even the worst institutional failures if given time, resources, and the determination to change. Whether they succeed remains to be seen, but the attempt itself deserves recognition. Bombtown USA earned its nickname through violence, corruption, and institutional failure that lasted decades. The nickname will persist because it captured something essential about what Youngstown became when two mob families fought over its territory and local institutions collapsed. But perhaps someday that nickname will be historical, a name that describes what Youngstown was, not what it is. For the people living there now, that future can't come soon enough. For historians and those who remember, the name will always serve as a warning. This is what happens when corruption becomes systemic, when violence becomes routine, when institutions fail and no one cares enough to stop it. November 23, 1962. A bomb explodes. An 11-year-old boy dies. His father dies. His brother survives, permanently damaged. And Youngstown, already bloodied by years of violence, earns national infamy as Bombtown USA. The echoes of that explosion still reverberate in FBI files, in cemetery plots, in collective memory, in the scars on a city that learned to live with thunder in its streets. The bombs have stopped. The silence has returned. But it's not the silence of peace. It's the silence of exhaustion, of survival, of a city too damaged to do anything but endure. That's the legacy of Bombtown USA. Not redemption, not resolution, but the quiet that comes after the explosions, when all that's left is to rebuild from ruins and hope the bombs never return.